Hey, this is Alan Powell from Anthem Lights. You're listening to Dispatch Radio.
Well, there's a great new book that's dropping March 24th. It's called All You Want to Know About the Bible and Pop Culture, Finding Our Creator in Superheroes, Prince Charming, and Modern Marvels. And no, I didn't write it. My wife's probably shaking her head right now, going, it sounds like something my husband would write. But it was not. I may have found my brother from another mother in Kevin Harvey in his new book. So, Kevin, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Brandon. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I think that the title alone warrants that we too may share a love for pop culture and scripture. Am I right?
It looks like it from taking a glance on your website and everything. It sounds like you and I could spend a few hours talking.
Yeah, we might have to just limit ourselves here and try to behave and schedule a follow-up. But a great sounding book. Tons of biblical information, trivia, but also just kind of a change of perspective, which is very important. And I'd love to know what was your motivation of putting the pen to paper.
Well, I think, I guess I would say my motivation is that I don't think that the state of pop culture is nearly as bad as many in the church might think it is at first glance. And I think there's, the more obvious things which are encouraging, like the huge ratings of shows like The Bible or Duck Dynasty or all the faith-based movies that seem to be doing pretty well right now. But even beyond the more obvious things, what I wanted to focus on in this book is just, if you dig deep and pay attention to the mainstream entertainment shows and movies, you're going to find a lot of moving stories of redemption, of forgiveness and grace, of people loving others as Jesus has commanded them. And, and even in the quote unquote worst of pop culture, the stories being told are probably no worse than many we find in the Old Testament. So I really that's what I wanted to do, is kind of paint a fresh perspective on pop culture of today.
Well, let's jump right in. Obviously, the title is very alluring for me. Superheroes, Prince Charming, and Modern Marvels. So, give us an example, and I'm going to take Superman off the table because that's just so easy.
Yeah,
another, I mean, literally to the point where J.J. Abrams has to put in Zack Snyder had to put in the cross type form for a moment when he's in space in one scene. I mean, it's just they're so blatantly trying to make the parallel. Go to another big name superhero, or how about something like the Avengers? Where do we find scripture and the parallels and something like that?
Well, there's one of the Avengers I included in the book. It was Thor, and it was less the actual character, but more in the one scene in the first Thor movie where he offers himself up in front of the Punisher, I think was the name of the giant machine sent down to Earth, and there's some parallels in that scene where he's offering himself up as a sacrifice and talking to Loki to not take them but take him. And I thought it was a really neat comparison to the crucifixion of Christ. So that's one small example taken straight from the Avengers storyline. There's
definitely a lot of self-sacrifice, and to prove my uber geekdom to those listeners, and my wife will again shake her head, it was called a destroyer. Just so we're clear.
Destroyer. I knew, I knew that. Yes, I know. I just had somebody return a book just now.
I called him out on something he wasn't quite prepared for, folks. Don't hold that against him. You got to get your copy. Where does something like Prince Charming land? Because obviously, we have Cinderella. It's in the theaters right now. So when we go see Cinderella, how are we going to see some of God's themes manifest itself?
Well, I just wrote something up today on my blog, BibleandPopCulture.com, that had to do with the new Cinderella movie. It obviously did not make itself into the book, but maybe, hopefully, the next one. But I took my daughter to see that last week and really enjoyed it. And I thought there were some neat things from the movie version of Cinderella that were so cool, and especially at the end when Ella, what she goes by during the entire movie, when she presents herself as Cinderella to the king, or it's the prince who has now become king. I think that's just a neat symbolic representation of how we are to come to our King, King Jesus. Just presenting ourselves humble and just as we are, and see if he'll accept us. And of course, we know he does, just like the king took Cinderella.
We're talking to Kevin Harvey. He's the author of a new book called All You Want to Know About the Bible and Pop Culture, Finding Our Creator in Superheroes, Prince Charming, Other Modern Marvels. And we're discussing how different themes that are biblical in nature and in creation are still manifesting themselves in TV shows, pop songs, films, that kind of thing. So, Kevin, I think obviously it's, pretty apparent to Christians, and they get this appalling nature, especially with reality shows, and we've got all sorts of, polygamies being glorified, extramarital sex, teenage sex. These things are being, glorified in reality TV and those kinds of things. Would you also say, though, besides Duck Dynasty, are we seeing other reality shows that people may not be aware of where, hey, Christian morality, biblical teachings are still kind of manifesting themselves?
I would have to say that I don't know if I can't think of any off the top of my head that are being intentional with that, as like Robertsons are with their show. I know that there are, some like the Duggards on the TLC, and there's a new show on the Up Network which I haven't caught that has to do with their Christian family. So I think it's pretty encouraging that more families are like that are getting represented. But something I write about in the book, in the chapter that deals with reality shows, is just deals with some of the crazy families that we see on reality shows, like the Kardashians and the Real Housewives, and not necessarily glorifying them or lifting them up by any means, but but looking at them as compared to many of the families that we see, like in the Old Testament, like Cain and Abel, or David's kids, that there was rape and murder and going on with all of them. And, a lot of these families that we look at in such a down way, they may not be too bad off, when compared to some of the other families in the Bible that God still used later in their lives. And I think that, with some of these families that we see on television, there's definitely still hope, and God can still use them.
And obviously, I think you'd agree with me too. Obviously, music is a place where I think we probably will always find biblical influence. We'll always find artists that are spiritually being touched and moved to write about different elements of the Bible, and the gospel manifests itself in different ways. And so, is there a particular artist that you mentioned in the book, or someone that really stands out to you?
There is, well, I'm sure you remember the show Lost, and one of the producers and writers behind that, his name is Carlton Cuse, and from what I'm certainly not in the industry, but just I've heard on different occasions that he was one of the reasons for many of the spiritual, biblical parallels in that show. And then recently, his name is attached to a new show on A&E called The Returns that has some neat things in it that I'm starting to notice. And
The Returning, right? Returning. We interviewed Mark Pellegrino. Yeah.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, Jacob, absolutely. I love it. So he's one that I certainly don't know him personally. I would love to. One day I'd love to sit down and talk with him someday, but I can't help but wonder if he's purposefully putting in some of these stories.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it does manifest itself in a lot of different shows, spirituality-wise. And you touched on some of the mainstream faith-based films, but there were a lot of other interesting windows being burst this last year. I wanted you to chime in if you could. One of them was called The Song, and it really based on like the dark side of David's redemption, with the character having a music background, and that it was adapted very well, but it really challenged Christians differently. Now, that's still a faith-based film. Do you still see, though, with other things? I mean, we could always talk about something like, even Game of Thrones. There's a lot of spiritual challenges, even in the most secular, we're talking about cable television, that is still out there. Is it right, Kevin?
Absolutely. One of my favorite current shows right now is The Blacklist. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but the main character on that, played by James Spader, Raymond Remington, he he's struggling, and he is quote unquote a bad guy, but he is definitely looking for redemption. And there was even an episode, I believe it was the episode that they premiered after the Super Bowl, where he's telling his FBI friends, talking about, looking for the light and, reason to find, see that he's a good guy. And you see that in so many other characters as well in other shows. Where there are people, just looking for redemption. They look in the mirror and they know that they're not right.
So how much is it, society is reflected in pop culture? Is it manipulation of pop culture? Is it still just individuals and their personal beliefs being manifested? How do you think that formula really kind of puts things together for the creative processes that are happening in New York and California that are basically producing most of these things?
Right. That's an interesting question. I wish I could speak for them. I don't know. I can't help but some of them are definitely being intentional with beliefs. I know that there are believers, there are Christians in Hollywood trying to make a difference, and they know that in order to get in the mainstream, they have to make some compromises on the content, and they sneak things in certain ways, perhaps as was done in shows like Lost. But I can't help but also wonder, everyone, no matter what their beliefs, they're still a child of God, and we are made in the image of God. And I think unintentionally, many are mimicking, the greatest story ever told from the best-selling book ever written.
Absolutely. Kevin Harvey talking about his new book and this link, this way that pop culture is being used by God to reveal his truth, for lack of a better word, to reveal his different themes and messages and manifesting in modern television, film, songs, other aspects of pop culture. And I would like to challenge Kevin a little bit here with a film, or the two films that I think were definitely hot topics in the last 15 months, and that would be Noah and Exodus, where you have secularists, or at least, well, in Aronofsky's case, a vocal, nasty atheist behind the making of the projects. Where do you think there's benefit from that, and where do you think there's been harm from those two films?
I think overall that those two movies are a step in the right direction. Like many, churchgoers and Bible readers and who saw those movies, I wasn't crazy about, many of the decisions that were made involved in telling these biblical stories. But in the end, hundreds of millions of dollars that Hollywood could have spent on making some teen slasher movie or an R-rated comedy was spent on these movies, on putting the Bible on the screen. And so while I would not have made all the decisions that those movie makers did, I think overall, we should support these movies, if for no reason other than they're taking the place of something much worse.
Yeah,
and getting people. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm just saying they're getting people curious. I mean, maybe somebody after seeing Noah picked up the book of Genesis for the first time and read it. You can't say that's a bad thing.
Well, you're bringing up a very interesting argument that we didn't really go down to, and we've really mulled over both films pretty extensively. And you're kind of hitting something I really hadn't thought of, and that was, if they're spending their money on that, they're not spending their money on making something else. And that's a very interesting argument too, right? Because if they're going to continue to adapt the Bible, then at least the money's not being made on something else. And there's an interesting argument to be made there. That's an interesting angle on that.
Absolutely, yeah, and if it may, they're in the end, they're a business and they want to make money. And I don't know if they're totally against putting certain stories on the screen. I think they just want to make money. So if those movies end up making money, I didn't look at the final total box office totals and the Blu-rays. I know Exodus just came out on Blu-ray, but I don't know how profitable those are. But if they see them as profitable, then someone's going to be making a story about David and Saul or something else.
Well, there's definitely a lot still in the works, folks. We've talked a lot about those kinds of films and pros and cons, and I've aired my grievances many times on this show, so we won't go down that road again. And we'll spare Kevin my emotional rants on both films. But it is called All You Want to Know About the Bible and Pop Culture. It is a great, great book with a lot of very interesting information, and if nothing else, maybe it'll challenge some of the prudish nature of Christians, and I have to side with you on that, Kevin, where it seems like we're too busy as a church sometimes to just throw stones, boycott things, never find good in anything. Yet at the same time, the whole message of the Bible is like try to find good in everything, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And the unfortunate thing is, that many people, like you said, throwing stones or whatever, don't give it a chance. They just assume. Now, there are some things that I think, are safe to assume we, probably shouldn't take in. But there's a lot of things, a lot of good things out there that people would be surprised by.
Well, I'm going to sidebar on Kevin just a little bit here, just to make sure we're clear on where I come down on that too. And again, folks, make sure we use good judgment, right? If you're predisposed to certain kinds of sin, then you need to know there's certain kinds of things you don't need to be subjecting yourself to. And if pornography and nudity is on that list, then you don't need to be at a rated R film and be subjecting yourself to stuff that's going to allow the enemy to creep into your mind and your soul and your spirit. So, Noah and Exodus, if I ask you and you haven't watched it, we're not really going to have much of a discussion if you really haven't seen it yet. You're just taking my word or other people's words and criticisms of it. And I couldn't agree more with Kevin. There's nothing to be afraid of. Our God is over all, and he's over great things. And this is a great challenge to that. It's a great commentary on many, many things that people may not be familiar with. And I can't thank Kevin enough for fitting time into his busy schedule to talk to us about it. And we'll make sure we link to Amazon and some of the other stuff. The book comes out through Thomas Nelson, so I'm assuming it's going to be a pretty broad drop and wide open to everywhere, so you should really get a copy pretty easily. All you want to know about the Bible and pop culture, finding our creator and superheroes, Prince Charming, and other modern marvels. Well, thank you again, Kevin, for making some time for us.
Well, thank you, Brandon, for having me. I really enjoyed it.